how did you feel as brother to both to be watching Owen's rise up the card in 1994? Because obviously you speak to anyone about Owen and they, he was just universally loved and adored by everyone who encountered him. But he really, really was incredible as being a despicable heel, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. I think Owen, that was part of his humorous nature because he liked to pull a lot of jokes and pranks and get a good laugh, at somebody else's expense. Always pretty harmless. But so I think for the heel role, it was natural for him, just to um, do things that that pissed fans off and be and not go overboard, not be coarse or anything, but just be kind of sneaky and deceitful and ambitious and jealous of his older brother, and he pulled that off really well, and yet he was still a great performer in the ring. He was sound technically, like Owen was an incredible performer. He could work heel or babyface, and I'd say equally as talented as Brett, but they were both better in certain areas. Owen I think was more of a high flyer. Brett maybe a little more of a technical wrestler, but that's why they balanced each other so well. As opponents, and and then it was only fitting they would kind of reunite, and the whole Hart Foundation was reestablished in that great storyline. And then they brought in Davey Boy, and they brought back Jim Neidhart, and then added Brian Pillman, who had a real connection. A lot of fans didn't realize, he was Bruce's tag partner in Stampede for several years, and had learned and trained in the dungeon, and Bruce had been his teacher, and they were even going to bring Bruce back as part of the Hart Foundation, and I think he would have added something there, and there's just unfortunately some political influence in the background, and they decided not to bring Bruce in, but he could have very easily fit in there, because he was a older brother, to all of them. Bruce actually had the most influence on my brother Owen's career. He taught Owen, he inspired him as a booker. He gave Owen his first break on Stampede. So there's a lot of connections there, but even with the groupings they had with that Hart Foundation, it was I think a real boom period for wrestling, because there were so many other factions they could compete with, right? With Triple H and Shawn Michaels and their group, and then the black group with The Rock and Ron Simmons and some of them, and there's all these factions kind of competing, and the Hart Foundation were baby faces everywhere in Canada, heels in the States, so it was great. I think it created a lot of interesting storylines, and even some cultural and ethnic storylines, that were really big, especially when, you had American audiences hating the Canadian wrestlers, and in Canada, we hated all the American wrestlers, and then, I think getting kind of mixed reactions in Europe and those other places. But, it was pretty exciting when they had that Stampede pay-per-view in 1997. It was just incredible, the reaction the whole Hart Foundation got, and it set up the SummerSlam matches after with Owen and Stone Cold, and I think Davey Boy and Ken Shamrock, and Brett working with the Undertaker. But and there's really been nothing ever since like that. The WWE's never even had a pay-per-view during a Stampede since then. They've kind of missed that opportunity, and it was kind of unfortunate how it all kind of dissolved with the Survivor Series incident in Montreal, because there was so much potential there. There was so many more storylines and feuds. I think Brett and Stone Cold could have had a really long run, and I think it would have been a better move for Brett to drop the world title to Stone Cold at the next WrestleMania, but unfortunately, when contract negotiations fell through with WWE, they decided they had to have Brett lose it to Shawn Michaels, and that was just not acceptable to Brett, because Shawn had earlier refused to pass the torch. He was supposed to lose the title back to Brett at the previous WrestleMania, and then he had a questionable injury, and that match never took place. And then he made it pretty clear to Brett, so I'll never ever drop the title to you. So I certainly defend Brett and his decision, not to lose the title in Montreal, but and I think he would have pass the torch on to anybody else, if it had been Stone Cold or Mankind or somebody else, he would have been fine with that. This wasn't so much about Brett being a prima donna or trying to protect his image or not wanting to lose the title. It was just the fact that it was, Shawn Michaels, who had also refused to put Brett over. So, I think Brett was within his rights, and at that time he did have creative control over his contracts. So I adamantly defend his position. And just saying I'm not going to lose the title to him in Montreal. And I think there's been a lot of just a lot of allegations, that he was going to go to WCW as a champion, and he didn't want to do the time-honored tradition of passing a title on to somebody else, and that wasn't the case. It was really just such a personality conflict with him and Shawn Michaels. Yet they had incredible matches too, and it's really unfortunate there was this hostility between them, this personality clash between them, because they probably could have worked a much longer program, and done more business together. So.
Well, I mean, in many ways, the trajectory of Brett and Shawn was just too similar, wasn't it? They were so good individually and then collectively, and their rises were at such a similar time that it was bound to come ahead eventually. I mean, I've always landed on Montreal as it being a power play, a way to weaken a big acquisition for WCW, because I've come around this in my head so many times before, thinking, Shawn and Taker were in a program in September and October 1997. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to make that what would have then been called a triangle match, but to have made it a triple threat match.
Yeah.
And to have had Brett lose the title to Taker. And then the next month, Shawn screws Undertaker, and then you still can go towards Austin. And that no one is questioning whether Stone Cold was the right person to become world champion by April 1998. Of course he was. He was the biggest thing in wrestling by far. But there was a ready-made scenario to have Brett lose to someone that he respected in a way that could have still led to the same match. So you'll never hear me kind of question whether or not, it was the right thing to do, because there were so many other alternatives to what happened that night.